London, December 1945. The city is still smoldering. Entire neighborhoods remain collapsed skeletal frames of brick and steel. 6 years of war have ended. But the silence that follows feels less like peace and more like exhaustion. In the marble halls of the Treasury building on Surmise, a small group of men in dark suits gather around a table covered in ledgers and cable dispatches from Washington. They are not discussing victory parades or reconstruction plans. They are counting what remains, and what remains is almost nothing. The British Empire, at its territorial zenith, controlling a quarter of the world's population and landmass, is functionally insolvent. The war has been won, but in a way no one anticipated. Britain has lost something far more permanent than cities or ships. It has lost its economic sovereignty. And the entity now holding the mortgage is 3,000 miles away, across an ocean that once served as a barrier but now functions as a highway for American influence. This is not a story of military conquest. It is a story of financial asphyxiation, slow, methodical, and almost invisible to those experiencing it. The transfer of global economic power from London to Washington was not announced with treaties or declarations. It happened through loan agreements, currency clauses, and the quiet recalibration of who owed what to whom. By the time British policymakers understood what had occurred, the structure of the world economy had already shifted beneath their feet. To understand how the United States dismantled the British financial empire without firing a shot, you have to go back to the moment when Britain's survival became dependent on American dollars. And that moment arrived long before Pearl Harbor, September 1939. When Britain declared war on Germany, it did so with an economy still scarred by the First World War and the Great Depression. The Treasury's gold reserves were adequate but not deep. The expectation, as in 1914, was that the war would be short, financed through domestic savings and modest borrowing. Within months, that assumption collapsed. The cost of mobilization, the fall of France, and the desperate rearmament program meant Britain was burning through its financial reserves at a rate that would exhaust them within a year. The United States, still neutral, watched from a position of extraordinary economic strength. It had gold, it had industrial capacity, and it had something Britain needed more urgently than munitions: liquidity. The problem was that American law prohibited direct loans to belligerent nations. The solution, from Washington's perspective, was elegant. Britain could purchase American goods, but only if it paid in cash dollars or gold and carried the goods away in British ships. The policy was called cash and carry. What sounded like a reasonable commercial arrangement was, in practice, a liquidation sale. Britain began selling off its foreign asset stocks, factories, real estate to raise dollars. American investors quietly acquired controlling stakes in British holdings across South America and Canada. The empire was not being conquered. It was being purchased, piece by piece, at distressed prices, and every sale weakened Britain's ability to generate independent revenue from its overseas investments. By the summer of 1940, with German forces across the Channel and invasion imminent, Britain's cash reserves were nearly depleted. Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent a stark message to President Franklin Roosevelt: Britain could no longer pay. Without American aid, the war effort would collapse, not from military defeat, but from financial exhaustion. Roosevelt understood the stakes. If Britain fell, the United States would face a hostile, Nazi-dominated Europe. But his response was not charity, it was restructuring. March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act. Congress authorized the president to lend or lease military equipment to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to American security. Britain would receive ships, planes, food, and fuel without immediate payment. The bill was framed as generosity, a lifeline to a struggling ally. But the terms, buried in the bureaucratic language of the agreement, told a different story. Britain would not repay in cash, it would repay through concessions. American officials extracted commitments that reshaped the architecture of global trade. Britain agreed to dismantle its system of imperial preference, the network of tariffs and trade barriers that gave British companies favorable access to markets across the empire. American goods would now compete on equal terms in India, Africa, and the Caribbean. The protected economic zone that had sustained British industry for decades was being pried open, and the crowbar was American aid. There was another clause, quieter but more consequential. Britain agreed that any surplus goods received under Lend-Lease would not be re-exported or used to compete with American products in third markets. The effect was surgical. British manufacturers, already struggling with wartime production constraints, lost the ability to rebuild their export economy even as they received American supplies. The aid kept Britain alive, but it also locked British industry into a subordinate position within an American-led economic order. Roosevelt's administration understood something the British Treasury was slower to grasp. Debt is leverage, and leverage is control. Every ship, every tank, every ton of wheat created an obligation that could be called in later, not in dollars, but in policy. August 1945, the war ends, the bill arrives. The United States had provided over $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid to Britain, roughly equivalent to $500 billion in today's terms. The question now was repayment. Britain, its economy shattered, its infrastructure in ruins, had no means to settle the debt. American negotiators arrived in London with a proposal, a loan of $3.75 billion at 2% interest, with repayment beginning in 1951. The loan would allow Britain to buy time, stabilize its currency, and begin reconstruction, but the conditions attached to the loan were transformative. Britain agreed to make the pound sterling fully convertible into dollars within 1 year. This meant that anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars at a fixed rate, effectively ending Britain's ability to control capital flows in and out of the country. For an empire built on the management of sterling as a global reserve currency, this was a surrender of monetary sovereignty. The rationale from Washington was clear. A stable, open international economy required currencies that could be freely exchanged. No more closed currency blocks, no more imperial trade zones. The world economy would operate on principles of free convertibility and multilateral trade, overseen by institutions based in Washington, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Britain, desperate for the loan, signed. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. When sterling convertibility was implemented in July 1947, a massive flight of capital began. Investors, fearful of Britain's economic instability, converted pounds into dollars and moved their wealth to New York. Britain's reserves hemorrhaged. Within 5 weeks, the policy had to be suspended, but the damage was done. The message to global markets was unmistakable. London was no longer the safe harbor for international capital. New York was. The architecture of dependence. What followed was not a single dramatic collapse but a cascade of compounding pressures. Britain faced balance of payments crises throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. Each crisis required intervention, loans from the IMF, support from the U.S. Treasury, negotiations that came with conditions. Gradually, Britain's ability to set independent economic policy eroded. The empire, already granting independence to India and Palestine, could no longer be sustained economically. Colonial administrations were expensive, and Britain could not afford to maintain control over territories that were no longer generating revenue. The United States did not need to demand decolonization. The financial structure made it inevitable. Without the resources to manage the empire, Britain began a managed retreat. Each withdrawal weakened London's global influence and opened markets to American investment and trade. The sterling area, the network of countries that pegged their currencies to the pound and held reserves in London, slowly disintegrated. By the 1960s, the dollar had replaced sterling as the world's dominant reserve currency. The mechanics of this transition were technical currency agreements, trade balances, loan covenants, but the effect was geopolitical. The British Empire did not fall to revolution or invasion. It was foreclosed upon, methodically, by a creditor who understood that financial dependency is more durable than military occupation, the inheritance. By the time Britain finally repaid its war loans to the United States in 2006, the world those loans had helped create was unrecognizable. The Bretton Woods system, designed in 1944 to institutionalize American financial leadership, had given way to floating exchange rates and globalized capital markets, but the underlying reality remained. The dollar was the system. International trade, commodity pricing, central bank reserves all operated in a framework where American monetary policy set the terms. This was not the result of a conspiracy or a master plan, it was the outcome of decisions made under pressure. In crisis, by nations trying to survive, Britain chose American aid because the alternative was defeat, but survival came at a price that compounded over decades, transforming a temporary dependency into a permanent structural shift. The lesson is not about American ambition or British decline, it is about how power moves through systems that appear technical and neutral currencies, loans, trade agreements, but which carry within them the architecture of control. The empire that ruled through naval dominance and territorial control was replaced by one that ruled through liquidity and market access. The flag changed, but the logic of hegemony remained. Those who control the terms of exchange control the system. What happened between 1939 and 1945 was not the end of one empire and the rise of another. It was the invention of a new kind of empire, one that did not require colonies or conquest. Only the quiet, relentless logic of debt and dependency, and that empire, built in the ruins of the old, remains the foundation of the world we navigate today. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.